what I would call like an anarchist critique to analyze the Pentagon Papers. Fascinating fucking book. You're gonna love
Can't
when
wait.
I bring this up to our conversation. I've learned a lot about the whole Vietnam War in ways that I think you'll find productive. But one of the things he says that I think speaks to like the social movement aspect of all this, as well as the necessity of bringing along a mass based and sort of getting real dirty and sort of anti-romantic. And it also might end up being emblematic of like a dead alien ethos, is that in the chapter, The Backroom Boys, Chomsky's discussing like criminal actions taken by the United States in relationship to like UN human rights. You know, he's on it in the 70s and he's on it like 10 years ago. But he writes, state power will conduct and seek to implement a different interpretation on which it suffers virtually no restraints. Like, in other words, the state will do whatever the fuck it wants. He writes, the law so conceived has no legitimacy. Which interpretation prevails in the international sphere, at least, is not determined by legal or historical argument, much as we may deplore the fact, but by the distribution of power. I want you to really hold on to the idea of like the distribution of power. And he ends at the bottom of the page thinking through like the Pentagon Papers and the actions of the Joint Chiefs and all this other kind of stuff. He ends by saying, considerations of cost are the sole factors inhibiting policymakers, so these volumes indicate. I have found no exception to this conclusion. Among the effective costs are those just noted. And the costs that he was noting were protests. Like anti-war protests freaked out the Pentagon planners to the point where they committed like arguably less atrocities, relatively speaking, than they would have if there was not an anti-war protest movement, including, he specifically cites, we just talked about it, the October 1967 March on the Pentagon.
Yep.
So, and then he continues here, and I want you, this is my last note. It was and still remains within the power of American citizens to raise these costs and thus to restrain the criminal violence of the state. And so like, that's kind of the point that was made on this show about the 2020 protests, where like the riots were kind of like issuing a bill to the state.
A way to discipline elites, as Nathan Tankus put it. Yeah.
Right. And to a certain extent, that's true. And what Chomsky will then also say is the way to fully account for the effectiveness of those acts, including riots and movements, etc., is to not only look at the costs that were imposed on the state, but also to look at the consequences of how the state reacted to that imposition. And when the state reacts to that imposition through more violence and more state terrorism, he raises a finger to say the blowback was worse than the punishment you gave. And in that sense, how do you defend that strategy? And I think that's really just an awesome question to kind of end some of this thinking on.